All righty, folks. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're going to allow more people to come in and join the conversation. My name is Eli Saltzman. We'll start in a moment. Just to inform you that we are recording this special webinar. We won't see you, but it is recorded. All righty, I see a couple of very familiar names. This is fantastic. We'll start in a second or so, or a minute or so. Fantastic. There you go. All righty, welcome, welcome, welcome. There you go. More people are joining in. This is fantastic. All righty, let's give it another few seconds and then we'll start. Once again, a reminder, we are recording this webinar. Oh. All righty. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'd like to express my gratitude to Avis Koyman and Rong Zhang for all their assistance behind the scenes that make this and all other events possible for us. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today for the first event of the spring semester, although it's pretty wintry and icy outside. It is titled Gaza After the Conflict, ? And we'll address that, current realities and future challenges, featuring a fantastic lineup of speakers that I will introduce shortly. I'd like to mention that our next webinar is titled The American Jewish Community in Israel, Past, Present, and Future, and it will take place online on Tuesday, February 17th at 6 p.m. Eastern. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. Today, we are meeting in a moment defined less by resolution than by transition and by uncertainty, I would argue. In recent days, the partial reopening of the Rafah crossing has offered a measure of relief, enabling the movement of people, small numbers yet, and humanitarian assistance into the Gaza Strip after months of near total isolation. At the same time, fighting between the IDF and Hamas continues, underscoring how fragile and incomplete this post-war moment remains. For Gaza's residents, however, and for those affected by the conflict on all sides, the line between war and aftermath is still painfully blurred. And so the question mark in the title, After the Conflict, is quite deliberate. While diplomatic activity has intensified, including the Trump administration's announcement that the parties will move towards phase 2 of its 20-point plan for Gaza, the gap between political declarations and realities on the ground remains wide. Whether these initiatives can translate into sustained stability, meaningful governance, and long-term reconstruction is far from certain. Therefore, I anticipate that tonight's discussion will not necessarily offer definitive answers or premature optimism. Rather, perhaps our more modest aim would be to assess the current conditions in Gaza and to explore the constraints and possibilities shaping its immediate and longer-term future. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers. Shelley Culberson is a senior researcher at RAND and a professor of policy analysis at the Rand School of Public Policy. Her research focuses on disaster and post-conflict recovery, immigration and mass migration policy, refugees, the Middle East, global education, and international development. She recently conducted work to develop a spatial and infrastructure vision for the West Bank and Gaza, a housing plan for Gaza and recovery in Gaza. Larry Garber is an adjunct professor at George Washington University and the University of Denver and a senior policy fellow at J Street. He spent more than 15 years as a senior official at USAID, including leading the USAID West Bank Gaza mission during the Second Intifada between 1999 and 2004. In 2025, he consulted for the United States Institute for Peace, reviewing and writing about the Gaza day after, quote unquote, policy plans. Larry is the proud father of two University of Maryland alumni, classes of 2021 and 2024. Last but not least, Dr. Natan Zaks is a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. His research on commentary on U.S. foreign policy, Israeli foreign policy, and domestic politics and Middle East affairs have been widely published and frequently quoted in major news outlets. From 2012 to 2025, he served as a fellow, senior fellow, and for 8 years, the director of the Brookings Institute's Center for Middle East Policy. As for the format of today's conversation, each speaker will start with about 10 minutes kind of offering some opening remarks, and then we will move to a more conversational setting among the panelists. The audience, please, you are encouraged to type your questions in the designated Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We will start with our first panelist, Shelley Culbertson. Please go ahead, my friend. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eli, for the kind invitation and the kind introduction. And I'm very much honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to all the comments and questions from the participants. So as Eli mentioned, the theme is after the conflict. And so I'm going to talk about what I think is getting a little bit less attention on that topic, which is the technical aspects of recovery. So currently, most of discussion, planning, and international focus is very understandably on the security, getting the Hamas situation resolved, the politics of it, and then there have been a number of grand scale visions of what Gaza could look like. But I want to go a level below that and talk about some of the technical aspects that can get in the way of a successful recovery, and talk about the need for planning for those issues, because if any one of these issues are not properly addressed, a longer term recovery could fail. So the discussion's based on 3 reports and a foreign policy article. The 3 reports are, we did a spatial vision for infrastructure for the West Bank and Gaza, and that looks at a range of sectors, including transportation, water, energy, the environment, etc. We did a housing plan for Gaza, so looking at the levels of housing destruction, coming up with urban planning and architectural techniques to develop a plan for where people could live in the interim. And the third is a bigger picture report called Pathways to a Durable Israeli-Palestinian Peace. And that focuses on everything from security, governance, economics, as well as some reconstruction pieces. So basically, the bottom line is that the levels of destruction are huge. I think we're all pretty familiar with the images and some of the numbers, but over a little bit of them, as they're definitely a cause for some sober realism. About 90% of residents have been displaced. About 70% of buildings are damaged or destroyed. All schools have been shut since the beginning of the conflict, with some informal education going on. And then a lot of critical infrastructure, pretty much similar to those other numbers, have been damaged or destroyed. And so estimates for reconstruction are at this point someplace between 50 and $70 billion. So that's a lot of money to spend. There could be huge amounts of funds flowing into Gaza to help it rebuild, but unless some of these technical issues are addressed, I think it's fairly likely that a recovery could stagnate. And so the implication, I think, for that is not to be despondent, but instead to work on planning so that this has a likelihood of success. Because if these issues are addressed, I think there's a big opportunity here for Gaza to start anew and perhaps have cities that join some of the other great cities of the Middle East, like Tel Aviv or Amman or Muscat or Dubai. So there's an opportunity as well with the destruction. So I think, but before I get into the 6 points, I would like to say that recoveries take a very long time, and there's been some perhaps over-optimistic estimation of how long they last. I think a number thrown around is trying to make a recovery happen in 5 years. But I think what we've seen from post-conflict and post-disaster recoveries around the world is that it takes a lot longer than that. So even, say, Hurricane Katrina in the United States with ample funds and without the same security considerations, that took 15 years to spend out the federal funding. And if you look at Puerto Rico, US Virgin Islands, Mosul, Germany after World War II, these are all places that, I mean, this can take decades. So I think we need to start with a realistic framework that this is going to be a longer term process. So 6 issues are property rights, rubble, housing, materials, management structures, and workforce. On property rights, so every piece of land belongs to somebody, but even prior to the war, land ownership was often unclear. Land ownership was based on a mix of local, Israeli, Ottoman, British, and even Egyptian laws. There were a lot of property disputes, informal claims, etc. So it was quite complex before the war. And so after the war, in order for recovery to happen, there needs to be some sort of approach to addressing the property rights, but in ways that are viewed as both fair and compensate people, but at the same time are fast. So trying to renegotiate every plot of land before rebuilding happens would probably not be efficient. At the same time, something also needs to happen so that it's perceived as fair in terms of compensation. The next issue is rubble. So there are an estimated 68 million tons of rubble. By way of comparison, Mosul, after the battle against ISIS, had 7 or 8 million tons, and they're still digging out of the rubble. So the rubble alone, the UN estimates that it could take 20 years, but that also relies on having access to equipment, etc. But within the rubble, there's also explosive hazards, human remains, etc. This is not a trivial undertaking and will take the right equipment, international companies, respectful handling of remains, and then dealing with the explosive hazards. But at the same time, the rubble could become a source of opportunity because it could be used as landfill, helping to create ports or offshore islands, rebuilding roads. So the rubble can be used as an asset. The next issue is housing. So 90% of Gazans are displaced, and probably about 3/4 of homes are uninhabitable at this point. And so if you look at the time frame for recovery, people aren't going to have homes back within 2 years or even 5 years. It could be a number of years, a very long time until people are able to move into more permanent homes. So there needs to be some kind of an interim housing strategy that both allows people dignified housing in the interim and then also enables longer term planning. So our housing paper looked at 3 approaches. First is camps. Given the scale of destruction, camps are going to be inevitable. And yet camps are terrible places. I visited a lot of them. They're horrible. And when they're built, the assumption is often that they're going to be there for a couple of months, a couple of years, and then people will go home. But the reality is that once a camp is set up, it often just lasts forever. And so if we work with that principle, one approach could be setting up camps that could be the neighborhoods of tomorrow with proper urban layouts. The next approach is incrementally rebuilding urban centers, allowing people to move back in and rebuild in places that are habitable and not dangerous. And the third approach is that some places are just so destroyed that the only approach is really to raise everything and to rebuild it. Next is materials. A lot of materials, construction materials will need to go in for this recovery. And yet, in recent years, there have been restrictions on materials going into Gaza under Israel's dual-use policies, which have restricted goods that are viewed as having both civilian and military purposes. So some of these goods are concrete, timber, rebar, really the basics of the construction industry. And there's some pretty good reasons for being concerned about those materials. I mean, after all, Hamas built some 300 miles of tunnels using materials along those lines. At the same time, those approaches really failed. I mean, they failed to both help Gaza have rebuild from previous conflicts, and they also failed to prevent Hamas from building. So a new approach is needed that allows goods in while addressing these security concerns. Finance. uh, there could be billions of dollars flowing in, and yet we've seen other recoveries and nation building efforts fail because the finances have not been adequately managed. So there was a recent US military report assessing Afghanistan and why that failed, 145 billion. And really, one conclusion was that it lacked oversight structures that prevented corruption. So getting these structures, getting them right is going to be key to making this succeed. And then finally, the workforce. A huge part of Gaza's workforce has been decimated. I mean, lots of young men have been injured or killed. Women had a very low labor force participation rate. And even then, there probably aren't enough people to do the rebuilding. So at the same time, there are a lot of opportunities that come from a recovery economy. So managing the workforce really requires both training Gazans, enabling them to get some of the opportunities, and then also importing people. And not managing the workforce can really be a delay in recovery. I think if you look at the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is perhaps one of the slowest recoveries in U.S. history after hurricanes, a key reason has been lack of a workforce and lack of housing to be able to bring in the workforce. So in closing then, it's really important to look at these technical issues and then put some realistic planning so that the recovery of Gaza and reconstruction doesn't have to be a quagmire, and it can learn from some of these other circumstances and provide new hope and help create a Gaza in the future that's prosperous and stable and contributing to the Middle East. So I will stop there and then pass it.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Very insightful comments. Let's turn to Larry Garber. Larry, how do you approach the topic? You had a different take in the past as a kind of a international aid representative on the ground. How do you see things beyond the technical aspects that Shelley was brilliantly delineating for us now?
So let me just start by saying that I agree with everything Shelley said in terms of the technical challenges. But I do want to take us back a bit to the current reality. So what Shelley's proposed, a lot of people would endorse, I included, and a lot of people would, particularly Palestinians, would like to see what she's talking about happen. But that's not the reality that they're living in today. And before you get to where we want to go, we need to at least be appreciative of the current situation. So again, to take a step back, and most of what I'll say at the outset, people know, but I'll just repeat it. The Trump 20-point plan has been now divided into these two phases. So phase one is virtually complete. The kinetic fighting has mostly stopped, with some violations claimed on both sides, but it's certainly not like it was before. So the ceasefire is holding. The hostages have been released. More than 2,000 Palestinian prisoners have been released. And the humanitarian situation has dramatically improved. So food is now available certainly compared to what existed during the summer when people were concerned about famine and starvation. The situation is much better. The markets are open. People are able to purchase food if they can afford it. And humanitarian organizations are able to purchase food too, to provide to those particularly vulnerable groups. Shelter, however, is a serious issue. And whatever we plan for months from now or years from now, the reality is, and again, people have seen these visuals on television, the reality is that it's been a very challenging winter, and the tents that currently exist are simply not fit for purpose. And the question is whether the international community, Israel, will be able to provide more durable tents, more durable housing, not for May, June, July, but for February, March, April. So that's an immediate problem. And even on issues like fuel and water, clean water, there are still shortages that are affecting the health of the population. And so that's a concern on the humanitarian side, today that has to be addressed again before you get to the next step. Phase two, however, has now begun, which again, some people were skeptical that it would begin, but it has begun. And it has, I'll divide it into two parts. One is sort of the institutional part, which is a lot of what President Trump has been talking about. So we now have a Board of Peace, which has a charter and has, 20 plus states have signed on. It has an executive board, which is made up of 9 people. I think 7 or 8 of them are Americans. And again, for those who are counting gender-wise, all but 1 are men. There's a second executive board called the Advisory Executive Board, or the Gaza Executive Board, that's somewhat more expanded, includes representatives from Turkey, Qatar, the Emiratis, Israel has joined, and it's not clear what its precise role will be, but it's now established. And there have been some back and forth between Israel and the United States over inviting some of those people. There's probably the most important position that has been established is that of the High Representative for Gaza, Nikolai Mladinov, a Bulgarian diplomat, who formerly served as the representative of the quartet during a 5-year period. So he's very familiar with the issues, very familiar with the players, and he's the guy who's going to be the intermediary between the various boards of peace and executive boards and this last institution, which is called the National Committee for the Advancement of Gaza. And these are led by Ali Shaf, a former Palestinian Authority minister. I met him way back when I was the mission director in West Bank, Gaza, when he was the deputy minister of planning. He's held other senior positions in the PA. Well-respected engineer, but unclear what his mandate is. He has his team includes 14 other folks. Again, well-respected, mostly known to the international community. Many of them served as ministers in the Palestinian Authority, so they have those credentials. The major gap is that there's no yet real international stabilization force, which everyone views as critical for ensuring the substantive parts of phase two. So the substantive parts of phase two include the question of disarming Hamas. And what does that mean? To disarm Hamas? Is it to take away all their weapons, to take away their heavy weapons? Who is going to verify that this happens? And so that still remains an open question. And is there the political will on Hamas's part to do even the minimum amounts? The second question is, will Israel withdraw? Part of the 20-point peace plan says is in effect some type of quid pro quo for Hamas disarmament, Israel withdraw. Particularly with Israeli elections coming up in the next 9 months, probably even sooner, will Bibi Netanyahu, want to take the politically dangerous step for him of beginning a withdrawal from Gaza? And again, what would be the sequence of those events? Third is the role of this committee that I mentioned. Again, they're trying to walk a very fine line between, on the one hand, accepting that they're quote unquote subservient to the Board of Peace and the direction of Special Representative Mladinov. On the other hand, they're trying to also establish their credibility in Palestinian terms by recognizing that the PA is a viable entity, that they're there as an interim to help create the basis for an independent Palestinian state, which they all subscribe to. So they're trying to walk this line, and it'll be challenging to see whether they can do so or not. On the reconstruction side, and again, not to take away from anything Shelley said, but there still is the question of where will this reconstruction take place. Israel controls 54% of Gaza. And so where will even the initial steps take place? Will they be on the Israeli side? And who will be responsible for that? Or will they be on the quote unquote Gaza Palestinian side, which is still controlled by Hamas, but hopefully would be controlled by this committee? But how would that actually work? Leaving aside even the logistic questions of what types of materials will come up. Who's going to manage this effort of reconstruction? Who's going to fund it? The $50 billion, maybe not a large amount of money to some of the Gulf states, but they've all invested in Gaza before. They've all seen their investments lost. And so what type of conditions are even those states, much less other states that have been burned before, willing to invest in Gaza without certain preconditions being in place? And the final question I'll ask is, where does the Palestinian Authority fit? The Trump peace plan actually talks about Palestinian Authority vis-a-vis the need for reform. So the questions are, again, what types of reform are needed? The Israeli view is very different from, I think, the European view and from the Gulf view. And then you have the question of, will Israel actually allow some of the reforms that are necessary to take place? So one of the major constraints on the PA right now, just as a practical matter, is lack of money, lack of finances, because they're not getting the transfer payments that Israel is withholding under the Paris agreements from the 1990s. There's also the question about the PA, for those who follow the internal Palestinian politics. The PA has announced elections in the West Bank for April 25th. These are municipal elections. The last ones were held in 2022. I actually was an observer for those elections on behalf of the Carter Center. Well run, well administered. They can actually do that well. But the question is, what does it matter at all? And what's now being introduced is an effort to get at one of the most difficult challenges that they face vis-a-vis elections, which is who should be allowed to participate. And the current decree that has been issued by President Abbas requires that all candidates and parties who want to participate have to recognize the PLO as the representative of the Palestinian people, sole representative of the Palestinian people, and implicitly the agreements that the PLO has reached, including the Oslo Accords and the like. And so whether Hamas or its affiliates will agree to that is unclear. So just to close, I'd say there are many questions and that are raised that people like myself can ask and not have answers to. And so we feel as planners that this is very, a very risky investment. But I will say, and this is important, that the Palestinians that I talk to are all convinced that the Trump peace plan is the only option on the table, and therefore they want to see us, those of us who are skeptical, drop our skepticism and do whatever we can to support this effort.
Thank you so much. This was very, very interesting, and it actually fits into constitutes some kind of a segue to Natan's comments that I hope will address these kind of aspects of U.S.-Israel geopolitics, regional politics, kind of the convergence or the incongruence between the two positions. Natan, the floor is yours, my friend.
Thanks so much, Eli, and thank you very much for having me. And thank you very much to Shelley and Larry for excellent points. And I'll pick up actually exactly where Larry left off, which is to say, I'm also going to detail and maybe try to give sort of partial conjectures about what the answers may be to some of these questions from the positions of the United States and Israel and others. But I'll preface all that first by saying this is the only game in town. And part of President Trump's major faults in certainly dealing with Europe, dealing with NATO, dealing domestically with the United States, and many other things in my mind, also give him some real advantages in the Middle East. And in that regard, this very messy plan is the only one we have, and I think we should all wish it success and work to make it succeed. The most important point, as Larry pointed out, is the role not so much of the Board of Peace, but what's underneath it, and that is the NCAG, the National Committee for excuse me, I'm blanking on the acronym. It is essentially what was the
Advancement of Gaza.
Administration of Gaza. Thank you. It's the technocratic government, as it was, which is ostensibly not affiliated with the PA, with the Palestinian Authority, and is indeed not affiliated with Hamas, and ostensibly some reservations from Israel, but in fact was approved by everyone, including Israel. The head of the NCAG is a former deputy minister of the PA, and so it is certainly a PA-tinted technocratic board, and it is one that has a very real asset, and that's something quite unique right now. It is actually accepted, at least pro forma, across the board by Hamas, certainly by the United States, which pushed for its convening, but also by the Israelis. And the what's now High Representative for Gaza, Nikolai Mladenov, as Larry pointed out, Mladenov is one of the very, very few people who actually speaks across the board and is considered to be very serious, very cool-headed, hard-headed, understanding exactly what the challenges are, and considered to be so by the Israelis as well as the Palestinians and the Americans. So really rather unique in that regard. His long years as the UN representative were unique as a UN representative in the sense that the Israelis took him both very seriously and appreciated his role, but he still was able, as a UN representative and a Bulgarian former minister, to he was defense minister of Bulgaria, to deal also with Hamas, to deal with everyone else as the UN. And this puts him in a very unique position right now, and I think everyone should hope for his success. The bad news, and there's a lot of bad news. The bad news is that the complexity in the plan, and this stems from exactly what you asked, Eli, which is a different view, geopolitical view by the United States, which is pushing this, and by the main parties who have been fighting this war, both Israel and Hamas. So there's a complexity of the plan and the bodies, which Larry described somewhat, but especially I think the interests of the two, Israel and Hamas. So the US is the one that pushed very forcefully to move to phase 2. And this in Israel in particular raised a fear that we can sum up as a fear of the Hezbollah model. So Hezbollah, the Lebanese, the main Lebanese Shia party, one of two, has for many years, until at least this war, but probably still, was by far the strongest power in Lebanon. It was the one, it did not have a monopoly over the use of force, but it had the primacy of the potential to use force. And it was considered semi-legitimate. It was at least accepted by the state, but it was not the one tasked with the day-to-day governing of affairs. So civilian life, civilian affairs were tasked to the Lebanese government, which Hezbollah affected and participated in, but was not in charge of, while Hezbollah could call the shots whenever it really wanted to. This fear that Hamas would have a Hezbollah model in Gaza, that it would be the force, it would be the one with the main guns, but task someone else with the civilian affairs, this was the fear that the PA had for many years in ongoing negotiations between Hamas and the PA over reconciliation and bringing the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza. But the terms of Hamas always included that Hamas would keep its guns and that in a sense it would give civilian responsibility to the PA, but not real authority in terms of force to the PA to govern Gaza in a real sense. This is exactly the fear that Israel has right now, and it's not an absurd fear, which is that Hamas may disarm pro forma, and it has certainly convinced the Qataris and the Turks, its main benefactors and patrons for quite a few years, and through them convinced the Trump administration that it intends to disarm. The Israelis, to put it mildly, do not believe it. They believe that Hamas will give some the big weapons to someone, but they will not give up the real ability to wield force over the long term. And in particular, because the Israelis, but I should say, not only the Israelis, also the new powers that be, view tunnels as an essential part of arms, and Hamas still has a vast array of tunnels, despite everything that was destroyed. And that is crucial for its ability to fight in the future, as well as larger arms, but all the way down to handheld guns. So Israel is very wary of that and deeply distrusting of the possibility of disarmament, which is absolutely key. And it's key also in the eyes of the NCAG, the new Palestinian administration, for its ability to create a new Gaza, one that Shelley described a bit, that I think all of us should very much hope for. 2 million people living there in absolutely horrific conditions. So from the Israeli perspective, this question of disarmament, of course, is absolutely central. And it's central because if you think even from the very start of the war, shortly after October 7th, Israel set out and ordered its military to have two main goals for the war. One was return of all the hostages, and second was disarming, not so much disarming Hamas, but removing Hamas as a governing and fighting body in the Gaza Strip. The hostages, in the context of the 20-point plan, it was point number 4 in the plan, I believe, remarkably were all returned. And this is a real sign of Hamas' seriousness, but also of the ability of Trump, but also the Qataris and the Turks to deliver on demands from Hamas. And this really is notable. It's all of the hostages and now all of the bodies as of last week. And that, from the Israeli perspective, really surprised many of them. It surprised, I think, many of us as well. Now the question is, of course, can Hamas have a governing role or a fighting role? And that rests on disarmament, which I already mentioned. And the second is on, I think it's item 13 in the 20-point plan, spells out no direct or indirect role in the government of Gaza. And that means there's no ability for Hamas to control or influence NCAG, but also no ability to then enter in the Israeli interpretation at least, to enter in the legitimate political process of the Palestinians that Larry touched upon, as it did in the previous elections that prefaced the very long-standing blockade of the Gaza Strip. On the Israeli side, there was another very crucial point, and it was not long after the beginning of the war. It was when Netanyahu declared that a future Gaza, which is something he refrained persistently from spelling out or even allowing many people inside the Israeli system to plan for it. The Israeli Ministry of Defense, for example, started planning for it and was shot down by Netanyahu, who wanted only him and his aide at the time, Minister Ron Dermer, to deal with that kind of thing. He declared no Hamas and no Abbas, meaning no PA as well, that Fatah is like Hamas, and therefore that is not kosher for the future of Gaza as well. Excuse the term. This was interpreted by some people as a domestic political move. This was a way of differentiating himself from the opposition, which at the time seemed very ascendant after the catastrophe of October 7th. But I think is also a deeper element for Netanyahu, which is he has always viewed the possibility of the PA ascendance, a reconciliation between Gaza and Hamas under the PA, as an opening for what he fears, the possibility of return of Palestinian state as a diplomatic possibility. Briefly on the Hamas interest, I'm not an expert on Hamas, of course, but if we think of Hamas, it has declared very clearly that it accepts the NCAG role and it will transfer over civilian authority. And it has declared, at least to its partners, that it is willing to disarm. What disarmament exactly means, of course, as Larry pointed out, is a big question. Its interest in the long term has partly been served by this process in a remarkable way. In the beginning of the war, for Israel, there was a clear interest to swap the Qatari influence in Gaza and slightly less the Turkish one for Arab countries that were much more palatable to Israel, chief among them the UAE, but also Saudi Arabia. And that interest was very central to the Biden grand plan for the day after Gaza. In fact, the way we're seeing in the end is Turkey and Qatar, along with Egypt, a different kind of country, taking the central role. The UAE and especially Saudi Arabia, a much more back role. The UAE may be taking a more central role with Mladenov, who's close to the Emiratis, but nonetheless, certainly this is more of a Qatari and Turkish affair. And it's one in which Hamas itself has gained a lot of legitimacy. American officials have met openly or almost openly with Hamas, something remarkable, really notable. And the Turks and the Qataris speaking, especially the Turks very publicly, but the Qataris not so publicly as well, on behalf of Hamas and allowing it to take a central role. So a very different thing than what Israel might have hoped for. I'll end just by saying two points about why I still think there is room for optimism here, or at least we must try to hope for some optimism. Although the Board of Peace Charter, which sort of laid out an alternative to the UN, hurt the Gaza affair a lot, because many countries that would have joined gladly, especially European countries, balked once they saw that this is supposed to be a new UN. Nonetheless, the effort on Gaza does have a lot of international legitimacy. It also has a UN Security Council resolution behind it. It gives the legislative power, actual legislative power to Mladenov and the NCAG for the next 2 years. They can change, annul, suspend legislation, Palestinian legislation, and can decide things, what can come in, what can come out, cannot. That is very important for many international bodies that traditionally have to work through the PA. Second, the ISF, the International Security Stabilization, excuse me, that was very central to plans in the beginning and has faltered so far to come about. It may come about soon. There may be a couple of countries joining, but regardless, it is not what it was supposed to be. However, the plans today are quite different, and they rely less on the ISF and more on a new Palestinian security force that would probably, again, loosely sort of affiliated with PA forces, but not under PA control. And they would be central in what is now the Hamas-controlled almost half of the Gaza Strip, sometimes called Red Gaza or Old Gaza by the Americans and the Israelis, whereas New Gaza, oddly named Green Gaza, but it's actually Israeli, not Hamas, that would be maybe territory that the ISF comes in and where Israel builds. Ideally, if NCAG is successful, manages to bring some authority in, manages to grow its authority, ISF can move the IDF back, probably not all the way, but some of it. We may see a new beginning in Gaza. It'll probably be very short of what we hope, but be considerable nonetheless. And very last thing. The problem here, as I pointed out, is that the main two parties, Israel and Hamas, have a very different long-term view than the United States. They want different things. For the NCAG to really succeed, it needs Hamas to cooperate. It needs Israel to cooperate, allow things to come in to really empower it. Neither of them is terribly inclined this way. I'll say from the Israeli and certainly the American perspective, not doing so would be a terrible mistake, even though the fears of Hamas not disarming are not only real, they are very justified. Nonetheless, the best chance to weaken Hamas would be to empower the NCAG, to empower Mladenov, and to empower a process that has been so far very successful from the Israeli perspective, notwithstanding all the many, many difficulties and mishaps that we've seen so far.
Thank you so much, Natan, for this tour of force, and all the panelists. Fantastic. I'm really blown away by these insights. This is fantastic. Shelley, you want to go first, perhaps? I think that one of the comments that was made, perhaps by Larry, and to some extent, perhaps indirectly by Natan, is that to what extent is reconstruction feasible while conflict is still persistent on the ground? How do you square that circle, given the continued fighting, albeit, as Larry said, kind of on a more moderate level of intensity, but it's still there. Certainly the political strife is there in the background. How do you intervene? How do you move from point A to point B? It's not the U.S. Virgin Islands, so to speak. There's no kind of fighting, warring parties there. How do you go about that? How do you circumvent that issue?
I completely agree with that point. I think it's not possible to do reconstruction while conflict is underway. At best there can be interim humanitarian mechanisms. There may be needs to say rebuild Rafah or rebuild parts that aren't under Hamas control, but those parts also don't have a lot of civilians in them either. So it's very hard to imagine any kind of reconstruction happening without the security and the political issues getting addressed first. And I think one of Larry's points was that the Gulf countries that had invested in after past conflicts in Gaza, they saw their investments destroyed. It's hard to imagine any private sector or other country that will be willing to invest in permanent structures without security. And it's also hard to imagine an actual process happening with fighting underway. So absolutely, the security has to happen first before reconstruction takes place.
Fantastic, Larry. You represented USAID in Gaza and the West Bank. What is the role of international organizations today, realistically speaking? Can they influence outcomes, or it's all somewhere in between DC, Jerusalem, Qatar, Turkey, somewhere in between?
Mostly yes, but I'll give a little nuance. I did represent USAID, worked for USAID. USAID does not exist anymore. in the real world, and there's still remnants of it that apparently are surviving. But the broader question, I'll take the opportunity to talk about the challenge that now exists that Israel, I think, has decided that it's an opportune time to take on the international community that has traditionally supported Gaza, or Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in the West Bank too. It's getting, to crunch time. So first there is UNRWA, which has been responsible for providing services to close to half of the population in Gaza and a significant number of people in the West Bank. And Israel has decided that it no longer will deal with UNRWA on a diplomatic basis, and is taking other steps, both symbolic and real, to prevent UNRWA from operating. That said, UNRWA still has 12,000 employees in Gaza, teachers, health workers, and others. It's still paying them. It's still trying to maintain services, bring back, the educational networks, bring back some of the other clinics and likes that they survive. But I think we're really hitting a crunch time in terms of whether or not they're going to be able to, sustain themselves, and if not, what comes in their place. At the same time, based on a law that was adopted or regulations that were adopted back in March 2025, Israel is demanding that various international non-governmental organizations that work in Gaza obtain registration. In some cases, it's re-registration, but the requirements for re-registration are twofold. One, that you have to hand over the names of all your employees, which the humanitarian organizations generally are declining to do because they view it as a security risk. And second, that you not be found to be guilty of delegitimizing Israel. And there are very specific criteria that they're using for determining whether an organization has engaged in delegitimizing Israel. The upshot of this is that 24 organizations were registered in December, and so are going to be permitted to operate. But 37 have not been able to register, including some of the major ones. Most notably, and it's the one that gets most of the press because it has by far the largest footprint, is Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières, which has a huge presence in Gaza in terms of hospital beds, in terms of physicians, clinics. And they were trying to negotiate with the Israelis. Last week, they issued a statement that suggested that they were potentially going to be able to reach an agreement, but it all fell apart. And yesterday, they issued another statement basically saying that the negotiations have fallen through, very critical of Israel's approach to the negotiations, and Israel the government basically sticking to its guns. And so March 1st is the deadline by which they're supposed to stop all operations. Not clear what that'll mean, whether they will continue, just not be able to ship either goods or have people go into Gaza, or whether Israel really will tighten the noose by cutting off financial flows and other actions that'll prevent them from operating at all. So the international organizations, I think, by most people's admission, have a critical role to play, certainly in this period, whether you want to look 6 months out for a different model, but certainly in this period, they're critical for addressing the humanitarian needs. And we're, like I said, reaching crunch time where someone's going to have to give in.
All righty, we have a bunch of questions. Our audience has risen and is awake now. But before that, I'm going to take advantage of the fact that I'm a narcissist despot and ask Natan just a question, if I may, before we turn to these questions for the audience. Natan, can you talk about the domestic politics side of it, of both the United States and Israel, kind of a key axis here? Israeli elections, probably, possibly, somewhere in the summer, September, perhaps October. Not October, October is a bad date as such. And what about the domestic setting here in the United States? This idea of America first, perhaps kind of the banner of MAGA, kind of turning into nation building, foreign wars, Iran, perhaps the deployment of forces. Can you talk about Israel, the United States from a domestic perspective, perhaps?
In 2.5 minutes. I'll try. I went long previously, so I'll try to be very brief. Israel is scheduled to have elections by October 26th. It looks like the budget may pass, so I think it may actually be on October 26th after the Jewish holidays. It may give Netanyahu the ability to say that despite October 7th, he is governing actually the first government to serve every last day since 1988. That was the last Israeli government to see its full term completed. Israel is full on in election mode. It kind of always has been, but it is even more so now. It is right now trying to pass, the government is not right now trying to pass a budget. It is hard to overestimate how polarized the Israeli polity is, how toxic the conversation is, not about the same issues about which the world is thinking about vis-a-vis Israel. So it's not about destruction in Gaza or what Israel did or didn't do. It is, of course, about October 7th, which looms extremely large. The plight of the hostages was very, very central to the Israeli psyche and still is, although now, of course, there is a chance to move on, especially now, right now. But it is about other issues. It is about conscription of ultra-Orthodox, the Haredis, into the military. It is about domestic questions, especially of the judicial revolution that the Netanyahu government embarked on at the beginning of in January 2023. Extremely divisive issues, but not really about these things. What it boils down to in regards to Gaza is that Netanyahu still sees himself as beholden to the very extreme right wing in his government. We often use the term extreme and right wing, etc. It really bears repeating. This is by far the most extreme right wing government Israel's ever had. It includes elements that Netanyahu's own party and Netanyahu himself always shunned prior to the last elections. And now Itamar Ben-Gvir in particular, is sort of a symbol of that, is a senior minister. This is very important. It's very important, I would say, even more so in the West Bank than in the Gaza Strip and in East Jerusalem. So Ben-Gvir is in charge of the police. The police has security authority in Jerusalem. And Bezalel Smotrich, who's the Minister of Finance, but also has a second hat in Ministry of Defense, very important in the West Bank. They have been real limitations on what Netanyahu does. I'll just caveat that. In Gaza, Trump has a genuine role in Israeli politics. He is very popular in Israel. He's especially after the hostages return, he's ultra popular on the Israeli right wing. And therefore, Trump is the antidote for Netanyahu, for the far right wing, playing a game that every Israeli prime minister, at least since 1968, has done. Look, actually, way before that, since 1948. Look, I really want to do what you think, but the president of the United States or the rulers of the world have told me otherwise. I can't, we have to do this. With Trump, that can work quite well on the Israeli right wing. We saw the Rafah crossing opening this week, for example. That is something that Smotrich would have, gone to war over, and yet it is happening because it was demanded by Trump via Kushner, his son-in-law. In the United States, this is more, I think, more than domestic politics in the United States, is domestic thoughts in the mind of Trump. Trump is not through and through MAGA. I think Vice President Vance is much more MAGA or much more America first in that sense, anti-interventionist in a deep sense. If he succeeded Trump, I think it would be a very different foreign policy in many respects, including towards Israel, by the way, very much towards Israel. There would be limitations. We shouldn't overstate it, but nonetheless, there'll be differences. Trump is, I think, very averse to open-ended wars, but he is not averse to using force, and he's not at all averse to using American might and tariffs and everything else. And in Gaza, very remarkably, and at least in utterances about Venezuela, although I don't think in practice, willing to take over protectorates around the world, Gaza, Greenland, anywhere else. And in this regard, this is an American game. I'll end by tying the two together. There is something quite remarkable, which is that the capital of Israel, the government of Israel and the Knesset have sat in Jerusalem since 1949. The world, some of it only recognized Tel Aviv for a long time. America recognizes. No one admits, however, that there is a third capital in Israel right now, and that's called Kiryat Gat. It's a small town in the south. a nice place. I have nothing against it, but it is not a place you would usually think of as a potential capital of anything. And that is where the CMCC, a giant American-led military effort, sits, where American officials like Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and others sometimes come and call shots, and where the Israelis are mostly receiving orders. This is an American game. The Rafah crossing opened not because Israel wanted to, it's because America decided it happens. This is remarkable. And if we see Indonesian forces, if we see Egyptian or Moroccan, less may be remarkable. They have relations with Israel, but even them entering into Gaza, this is a different reality. And it is one born of the fact that Donald Trump, through his many, many faults that we see in other arenas, his force of will and demonstrated willingness to use American force also give him enormous agency in the Middle East, for better or for ill, and often for both.
Thank you so much, Shelley. The foreign policy piece was brilliant, and there's a bunch of other studies that came out from RAND. Can you talk about things that the current administration is considering, or perhaps even introduced already? Perhaps the Kushner proposal, is one of the participants kind of mentioned. It kind of, in passing, addresses that. Of course, we can also mention Trump's Riviera vision, kind of the hotel imagery that came out. What's on the table from the government, from the federal government's perspective, from Trump's perspective now?
Yeah, I think many people saw the plans proposed at Davos, and it looks like there's a similar question in the chat.
Yeah.
And so from the federal side, there is this proposed plan. So the plan has some interesting elements, and the plan also has some open questions. So I think some of the interesting elements are that first, it's proposing that Gaza becomes a place that looks shiny and prosperous. These images are quite jarring. I think we're used to seeing clearly warfare right now, but even prior to that, this was a place of poverty, and that was not a place that looked cutting edge. So I think just showing that image of what could be I think it's changing the conversation. The plan has a port, it has an airport. It's talking about doing this quickly. At the same time, there are a number of open questions. So one is that it almost treats Gaza like a blank slate. Rather than going with the existing cities that are there, it divides it up into certain zones. And so does it make sense to treat Gaza as a blank slate, essentially raise the entire thing and rebuild it without respect for the heritage? And so our RAND plan proposed building upon the same cities, doing that incrementally. Another question is property rights, which I discussed. How do you do that, which is this level of development, without first coming up with an answer to that question? I don't think there's an easy answer. I don't have the answer. There probably are some precedents that we could learn from other post-war cases. It's important to move quickly, but that question does need to get answered. There's a class-based critique of the plan. In other words, it looks like the ocean front is high rises that look like they would be for very wealthy people, expensive real estate. So where do the average residents of Gaza live? And will this be going to be built in a way that equalizes that in some way and has more of a typical balance between all the different types of residents and their economy? So I think there are a number, and then one last issue is that it doesn't necessarily yet have a plan. Well, so you can have glossy high rises in the long term. In the interim, you need to have some camps and some places for that. And that's going to take some planning as well. So I think there's some interesting elements and some open questions with that.
Fantastic. Again, this is my fault, but we're going to try to squeeze in a couple of more questions. So if you can be brief, that's much appreciated. Larry, to you, I'm going to combine two questions, perhaps even three. What is the degree of popularity that Hamas enjoys today, present day Gaza Strip today, now? And the other point is, would they still support Hamas as their governing body, given everything that has happened since October 7th? And one more comment. You talked about the NGOs. It seems like news sources, one member of the audience says, seems like there's the number of NGOs willing to vet their staff is much higher. Is that inaccurate? Is that accurate? In other words, is there complete unwillingness on behalf of these NGOs to cooperate with the Israelis, to be vetted by the Israelis, or is it somewhere in between?
So I'll take that last question first. As I said, 24 organizations were granted registration by the Israelis, according to announcement, including some ones that, people recognize, Catholic Relief Services, Project Hope, and others, 24. What they were required to do in terms of handover names is not fully clear. They obviously handed over some names, some IDs and the like, but it's not clear what, how fully, whether there's everyone on their staff or not. But the Israelis also released a list of 37 organizations that they claimed had not submitted the application because they did not submit names. And that included not only MSF, but included CARE, included Save the Children, included Mercy Corps. So many of the major American, U.S. international NGOs are on that list. In terms of Hamas popularity, I'm not going to speculate. There are all kinds of folks out there who claim that they've done polls. I'm dubious of their validity. You can make the argument both ways. One, that Hamas, is the power that be, and so people are deferential to them, but also that they're the cause of all the suffering that Palestinians have experienced over the last 2 years. And I tend to believe that. I tend to believe that, Palestinians are fed up with Hamas, and Hamas knows it and wants to hand over, the current situation. They don't want to be responsible for it anymore. So they're perfectly happy to have Ali Shaf and his team come in, take over, and blame them. And, they'll sit in the back critiquing and maybe keeping some of their tunnels and militancy alive, but they don't want to be responsible for governing Gaza. And in truth, if you go back to 2006, when the elections happened, that Hamas was elected, they didn't even want to, in my view, they didn't want to take over at that time. It was, again, a confluence of events, which I think we, the United States, misplayed, that forced the division between Fatah and Hamas, and then forced ultimately the war that took place between Hamas and Fatah and Gaza, and Hamas took control of Gaza, and the PA was left with control of the West Bank. The final thing that I just would add, because on Shelley's point, is all these plans, look great, but politics do matter, and whether it's the internal politics of the Palestinians, whether it's the internal politics of the Israelis, whether it's the internal politics of the United States, it matters, and these plans are great. Just to give an example, in 1999, when I came to Gaza, we had money to invest in designs. And guess what we designed? A beautiful seaport for Gaza. There was an airport in Gaza at the time that didn't last a couple of years past the start of it. When it opened, it was destroyed when the Second Intifada broke out. So, like I said, my heart bleeds because I on the shelf somewhere in the USAID, library or wherever still exists, there are all these designs that we had that we paid a lot of money for, that haven't gone anywhere. And so, again, until the politics are some type of political agreement is in place, Kushner's plan and other plans are just plans, and we need to deal with the realities that we have right now.
All right, I'm going to combine and integrate a couple of questions into one, and I'm going to point that one to Natan with your permission. Can you talk about the Qataris and the Turks? These are, certainly not friends of Israel, certainly after the attack in Qatar, certainly after the decade-long, perhaps, deterioration of the relationship between Ankara and Jerusalem. To what extent is that a viable access to change something on the ground? Is this feasible? Is there political force here in the United States to force Israel into accepting their involvement, their influence there?
Qataris and the Turks have been very central to the Trump approach, and they're the ones who've delivered Hamas in a sense. So the approach that the Trump team took was a bit like the argument for the United States being so close to Israel and yet the main mediator for decades, which is that it's not supposed to be neutral. It's supposed to be the one that's able to deliver the party that needs to make concessions. And Israel has often been the one asked to make concessions because it had the power. And the United States was the one able to pressure it, but also to assure it and to bring it along. And here we have Israel, but also it's notable, although generally ignored, one of the agents in the story was also Hamas. There was a war, and Hamas was one of the sides of this war. And to bring about an end, it was necessary to bring about, for example, the release of the hostages and everything else, and a lot of pressure on Israel, of course. As I said, both parties, the Israelis, are very, very far from a vision that the United States would share, or the PA, or a future that would allow the Palestinians agency, or in the West Bank, and that's where American pressure will be. With Hamas, unfortunately, it is the parties that have real leverage over it, and those are the three that are taking the central role: the Qataris and the Turks, who have been the main patrons for them, and the Egyptians, who have a lot of geographic and other leverage simply because of where they are and also their history. They used to occupy the Gaza Strip themselves. Marwa asked, and I think it's an important question, would Qatari or Turkish forces be allowed on the ground physically? So they have a very important role in the Board of Peace. They are very central to the possibility of Hamas disarming. For Israel, the possibility of either Qatari or Turkish forces is not just an objection. It is a strategic, deeply held, and I would argue correct, sort of red line from the Israeli perspective. Could Trump force Israel to do something? Yes, he could force Israel to do most things. But this would be one on which Netanyahu might publicly even stand, on his back feet and say no. No. Could it be forced? Yes. But first of all, the political damage domestically would be enormous. And secondly, from a strategic perspective, if Turkish forces actually re-enter the Gaza Strip, they of course were the rulers, the Ottomans were the rulers until 1917. If they re-entered, they would have no intention of leaving. They explicitly, Erdogan does not see Hamas as a terrorist organization. He thinks they are freedom fighters, explicitly. The Qataris are less explicit about all this, but they have been the main backers in the Arab world of all Muslim Brotherhood affiliated parties, and certainly of Hamas, often in conjunction with Netanyahu sometimes. It's kind of the mob's attorney would be how kind of the Netanyahu would view them, but nonetheless the attorney with whom he dealt. But that would be one that wouldn't pass. I'll note on Qatar in particular. So Turkey and Qatar both loom very large now in Israeli public discourse. Turkey because it's a giant power in regional terms, and with the somewhat diminution of Iranian influence, some look to Turkey to be a future rival or something. The Qatari element has been very central in Israeli politics around what's known as Qatargate, which is a Qatari, among the many Qatari influence campaigns. It was hiring Israeli PR people, and some of them who were the very closest aides to Netanyahu in PR, who did or did not work as advisors to the prime minister. They claimed they were advisors to his party, not to the prime minister. Therefore, they were allowed to do private work for Qatar. This is a huge deal and a giant political headache for Netanyahu, something that his rivals are jumping on. Qatari troops, Turkish troops, this would be both strategically, but also politically, something that I believe Netanyahu would fight tooth and nail.
Fantastic. So we're just about to adjourn. So I'd like to ask you all, Shelley, Larry, Natan, if you were advising policymakers, and in a way you are because they're watching us, they're watching this event, what would be your advice, positive and negative? Do something and avoid something. What would be that thing? Do something to make, to bring about this, the day after the Gaza war, something that will kind of long-term create the conditions for prosperity and reconstruction. So Shelley, how would you approach that? One thing that they can do and one thing they should avoid doing almost at all costs? Sorry for putting you on the spot.
Yeah, hard questions, and this may sound simple. So there's a do and the don't. I think when the 20 points came out and Israel agreed to those, and then it looked like Hamas was starting to get there. I think there's a lot of optimism about what the future could look like with this. But then since then, it seems like it's very much stagnated and hasn't moved. And so the do is let's get this solved. That's easier said than done. But until the security and the political issues are worked out, and there's nothing that can happen in the future, and this place will be a quagmire for decades without that. So that's the do. I think the don't. This will be technical, but the don't is don't put in temporary mechanisms for humanitarian issues unless you're prepared to have them last forever. And I think that's what we've seen in many post-conflict situations where temporary situations are built, camps and whatnot, and then they last forever. So the Jabalia camp was built in 1948, and then it terrible place, and it later turns into a hotbed of radicalization. Don't repeat that by not planning the humanitarian response and the reconstruction response right now. I don't think anybody wants to see this happening again in 70 years. But that cycle will happen again unless these issues aren't addressed.
Fantastic. Larry, one do, one don't, my friend. What do you have?
Don't ignore the realities of Palestinian politics. They're real, and whether you like them or not, they have a history of their own. And you're not going to quote unquote de-radicalize Gaza just by waving a wand or snapping your fingers. It requires you an understanding of the underlying issues. And the one do that I would advise the administration to do, which President Trump actually hinted at a while back, is encourage the Israelis to release Marwan Barghouti.
Interesting. Natan, one do, one don't?
One do is empower the NCAG, empower the Mladenov effort. The Israelis need to be much more forthcoming with that than they are or will likely be. It is completely in their interest, especially if they want to weaken Hamas. Hamas alternative is always the best weapon against Hamas primacy. The don't is, and yet, don't underestimate Hamas's ability and intent to stick around, and its ability and intent to re-enter into Palestinian politics. Don't let the Qataris and the Turks call the shots here, even if they are necessary for the process. Try to use others like the Emiratis or like the Saudis, even though they don't speak to one another right now. Try to use other things. So power NCAG, but don't be blind to Hamas doing what Hamas does.
Thank you so much in my view at least, but I think the audience will share that perception as well, for a fantastic, brilliant conversation we had today. Thank you so much, Shelley, Larry, and Natan. Thank you so much, the audience, for attending this and staying a bit longer than anticipated or than planned, but I think it was worth it, at least as far as I'm concerned, as I said. Thank you so much. Have a beautiful, wonderful night. Take care, stay safe, stay warm if you're experiencing some ice and snow. We'll see you in our next event on the 17th of February. Thank you so much. Have a good night.